restaurant. So before I hand it over to our closing keynote speaker, I'll just do a brief introduction. So we have Andrew Burke here to speak for us this afternoon. Andrew's based out of Halifax, so definitely glad he could make the trip here today. Andrew and I met almost a year ago now at a conference in Vancouver where I saw this talk, more or less, and I really enjoyed it, and I thought it would just be a really great way to kind of cap off the day here at Targeting Quality. I think it's a really fun and interesting look at both quality and history and other kinds of interesting stories. So I'll turn it over to Andrew and hope you enjoy. Thanks.
I was about to do my guitar solo there. Okay. So, here's 4 weird things about dates and time. Weird thing number 1. Have you ever noticed that the names of the last 4 months of the year are wrong? So, September has a 7 in the name, but it's the 9th month. October has an 8 in the name, but it's the 10th month. Same with November. Same with December. What's up with that? As they say on the internet, the answer will surprise you. Weird thing number 2. It's 2018 right now, which is supposed to mean that it's been 2018 years since this happened, the Nativity, the birth of Jesus. Now, this is not going to be a talk about Jesus, but cross-referencing the Gospels or various historical documents, the consensus has generally been that this actually happened more like 6 BC or so. So why is it 2018 now instead of 2024? Turns out it's because of a love story. Weird thing number 3. Now this is one if you have a Mac or a Linux machine, you can try along, open up a terminal window and type cal, C-A-L. C-A-L is a little utility that gives you the days of the month. That's kind of handy, so there we are, right? But what's nice is you can give it arguments to specify any month and year. So for example, cal 7, 1867 shows you that the Fathers of Confederation are really on the ball by giving themselves a long weekend on the very, very first July 1st. So let's try another one. Let's try cal 9, 1752. This is a month with 3 weeks in it. But this is not a bug. Well, it's not a software bug. But it's because of a bug. And it's a bug that took centuries to discover and centuries more to fix. Weird thing number 4. At Christ Church College in Oxford, there is a bell that rings at 9 p.m. to tell everybody it's time to come home from drinking at the pubs and get back to work. Except this bell does not ring at 9 p.m. It rings at 5 minutes and 2 seconds after 9 p.m. And it turns out there's a really good reason for this, even if it's a little bit petty. So hi, I'm Andrew Burke. I'm an independent software developer from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I've been doing professional software of various kinds for over 20 years now, everything from HyperCard and Lotus Notes, if anybody remembers those, all the way up to Ruby on Rails, and most recently a whole bunch of React Native. And I've always been interested in sort of the crossroads of technology and culture and how they interact in various ways. And a while back, I came up with an iOS diary app called Remembery. It pulls in your social media feeds and photos and mixes those all together and everything. And of course, being a diary app, I had to do a lot of stuff with dates and times. And dates and times in software are, of course, those kinds of things that seem really obvious until you start digging in deeper and deeper, and they get weirder and weirder the harder and deeper you get. So this is a quality kind of testing kind of crowd here. What happens if I say the word time zones to people? Yeah. What if I say leap year to people? What if I say daylight savings to people, right? These are all these things, especially if you have a distributed platform with people in all sorts of different places who are all supposed to be able to coordinate. This can become a huge, hairy issue. I was getting similar things just working with my diary, with people writing in their diary while flying a plane from Japan to Los Angeles and getting upset that they went backwards in time while writing their diary. Anyway, all sorts of stuff. So I got really interested in this date thing, dates and times and where they come from and how they work and why it's all weird. And so I started poking around and digging into Wikipedia. And as you do, I fell into a Wikipedia black hole. Right? You know, that thing where you click on a link and you read an article and it's got a bunch of other links to interesting things. And you open new tabs on that, and you open other tabs, and you open other tabs and more tabs. And next thing you know, it's 3 in the morning, and you don't even know what 3 in the morning even means anymore because you've been reading up about time and everything. But what was interesting about this, I even read books, it was really crazy, but what I found interesting with this is stuff in here kept reminding me of the world of software and development. And it's not that surprising at the end of the day, because really, deep down, measuring time and describing time is about technology, but it's also about applying that technology and a lot of the weird kind of things that don't quite fit together properly into concepts that everybody in a culture can use literally every single day. And so this is something that really fits in with a lot of the stuff we do as programmers and as quality. Right? So I just introduced 4 weird things. And each of them has a story I'm going to tell over the next little bit. And then there's going to be lessons that I'll be pulling out, sort of statement slides that'll give you some things to take home with, possibly. So weird thing number 1. Why are some of the month names wrong? So here are the months in our standard calendar that we tend to use mostly here in Canada. It's what's called the Gregorian calendar. We'll get to that later. And these are the modern names of the months. And these are the names, more or less, that what the Romans used back in their day. And as you noticed at the beginning, the names of the last 4 months are kind of technically wrong. Now, since this is the Roman names for the months, presumably the answers for why this is are somewhere in Roman history. Now, I always sort of thought, and a lot of people have tended to think, that the reason for this, if you know a little bit of history, you'll know that July is named after Julius Caesar. Oh, there we go. And August is named after Augustus Caesar. And it seems pretty obvious that the months afterwards are the 4 months that have the funny names. So maybe they just stuck those months in the middle of the year and then shoved the other months over, and there you go. And that's what I always thought. And once I started looking into it, it turns out that that was wrong. Before they were July and August, they were still in the calendar. They just had different names. And those names were Quintilis and Sextilis. That's right, Quintilis for 5, like quintuplets, and Sextilis with a 6 in it. So that means that before they were renamed in the 1st century or so, half of the months of the year had the wrong names in them. So how did it was even worse, right? How did this get this way, though? The thing is, nobody really knows. As far back as we have records in Roman history, these have been the names of the months with the wrong names on them. Now, that doesn't mean people haven't tried to figure it out. And probably the best story of this is the Roman historian Plutarch. And he says his story is that way, way back in the very, very early days of Rome, 750 BC kind of thing, when Rome was just a collection of huts along the river, they only had 10 months. And if you only have 10 months starting in March, it makes sense. March, April, May, June, Quintilis, Sextilis, right? September, October, November, December. Everything fits together. The thing is, these months were still kind of 29 to 30 days. And they were, so they only end up with 300 days. So there's a whole bunch of extra time in the year. So what did they do? Well, and there's a whole bunch of time at the beginning of the year, where it would now be January and February. Well, what did they do with it? Well, as far as we can tell, they didn't do anything. They didn't count it at all. Now, if you're in, now central Italy in January, February, kind of is like March here, where it's kind of damp. Sometimes it snows, it's muddy. And remember, this is really, really early days. Everybody in Rome was either a warrior or a farmer, or sometimes both. And if you're a farmer, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing to harvest, nothing to plant. You're just waiting. And if you're a warrior, it's way too muddy to go out and try to fight anybody. So basically, they just sort of waited until the weather got better, and then they could finally get out and do things. And they just didn't even bother counting that time. Now, obviously, as Rome got more sophisticated, they had things like salary, which is, of course, a Roman word, monthly interest payments. They met other cultures that did measure all the time, all the parts of the year. They decided that we need to catch up and get things worked out. So they added January and February and put those into the space at the beginning of the year. But the rest of the months stayed where they were, because that way you didn't have to rearrange your whole schedule. If an event was in June, it stayed in June. You didn't have to worry about backwards compatibility. It was a nice transition phase. However, with the downside, we have these legacy names stuck here. But we now have dealing with this legacy leftover transition phase for almost 3,000 years now. Whoops, there we go. So lesson number 1. Names have 2 roles. They are to label things, and they are to describe things. And those usually, ideally, you can have both of those working. They're both valuable. But sometimes the label sort of shifts away from the description of what the thing actually is. And in technology, we're naming things all the time. We name a lot of things. We name variables. We name products. We name functions. We name concepts to help users understand things. And think about how those labels and the thing underneath them sort of shift over time. It's a common enough thing that happens, and it's often a thing that happens in terms of dealing with quality issues, of understanding what's actually going on in your code. And our UIs are full of these kinds of situations. Think of how Microsoft Word always had the floppy disk icon for saving, even years and years and years after people didn't even know what a floppy disk was. Of course, they were actually encased in hard plastic. It was very confusing to even explain what that was. Anyway, so that's the kind of thing to keep in mind, how the label and the description can sometimes shift. Lesson 2. So the names we've been using are technically wrong, but that's OK, because standards don't always actually have to make sense. Sometimes just being a standard is enough. Because really, who cares that October means 8, but it's actually the 10th month, as long as Halloween is in it, right? That's the really big important part. It doesn't really matter what the name stands for. The consistency of the label has been much, much, much more important than the meaning of that label for literally thousands of years now. And lesson 3, the idea that people didn't even bother naming a chunk of the year seems completely outrageous, but it does make some sense, because people don't like to track useless things that suck. Now, as developers, we're often tempted to put all the details in, right? Every single piece of something that's going on, especially, we're talking QA, we're talking about testing, we want to get that 100% test coverage, we want to cover all the bases. But in a lot of the time, we should really think about, especially for user experience and dealing with management and stuff like that, think about all the details we can maybe hide away or not deal with, just to keep things clean and clear for everybody. I always like to think of this when I'm planning out a process or workflow or some kind of user experience, because I figure if the ancient Romans could skip an entire sixth of their year, and they still managed to do pretty well out of that, I could probably skip a few steps too. Anyway, people are more resilient to incompleteness than I think engineers often think we are. So, story time. Why is it 2018? Once upon a time, in Dark Ages Britain, Queen Anne of Northumbria had a problem. This is exactly what she looked like, by the way, exactly. The cameras back then. Well, she was in the last week of fasting for Lent. Her husband, King Oswy of Northumbria, was already celebrating Easter. Now, this was religiously and politically kind of awkward, and it was not really good for their relationship. Now, this situation turns out to be the pivot point about why we call it 2018 right now. Now, in history, most people tended to count years pretty short term a lot of the time, especially Dark Ages Europe, mostly how many years since the latest king was a king or since some big event or something. Only really specialists had to deal, like astronomers had to deal with things like long time tracks of time. And that was fine for most day-to-day stuff, except for Easter. For various complicated theological and symbolic reasons I'm not going to go into right now, Easter is closely related to the Jewish festival of Passover. And then this leads to an issue about how different civilizations measure time. So it's going to roll back a few things about some facts about how dates and times work and how people tend to measure them. There's been sort of 3 main ways to measure time that almost everyone has used throughout history. There are the day, which is really obvious, sort of day-night kind of thing. There is the month, which is traditionally been actually the phases of the moon, the cycle of the phases of the moon. It's even in the name, month, moon, right? And that's about 29, 30 days. And then there's the year, which is a little bit trickier to track because you can't just look up and see where it is. But if a little bit of work, you can figure out it's a full cycle of the seasons, and you can get very precise with it if you have some basic astronomy going on. But the thing to note, though, is that months don't fit very cleanly into years. It's 12.3685 months in a year, which means you can track one or the other, but not both, and have them fit nicely. So every civilization has had to kind of figure out which one they want to do and how to sort of mix those two together. And the calendar we tend to use here, the Gregorian calendar, is a solar calendar, which means our months aren't connected to the phases of the moon. It's completely separate. However, a lot of other calendars around the world and in history have been lunar calendars. So the traditional Chinese calendar, the Islamic calendar, and the Jewish calendar have tended to be lunar, which means events that happen in the same date, like Ramadan or Passover or Chinese New Year, in a lunar calendar look like they move around in the solar calendar because there's this mismatch. So this became a bit of an issue when you're figuring out when Easter is, because it's a solar calendar event that's happening in related to a lunar event. And when Christianity was small, it would be basically to just ask the local Jews, when is Passover? And they just work it out. But when it was spread across the giant Roman Empire and there wasn't always local Jews you could ask, it became much more complicated. But finally, after a lot of arguing, which the early church was really good at, lots of arguing about fine points of everything, they came up with 3 simple rules for figuring out Easter. And those rules are, Easter is the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox. Easy, right? I mean, this is a great spec. You got 3 simple rules, came down, they finally figured it out. How difficult could that be, right? Well, the problem is, this depends on solar calendar for the spring equinox, the phases of the moon cycle for the first full moon, and this arbitrary 7-day thing for the Sundays. All of these are mismatched, as you saw on another chart. They don't have like round, nice numbers. So it became really, really difficult. There's also weird rounding errors. What happens if the full moon lands on a Sunday? What if the spring equinox is on a Sunday? All these different things. There's all sorts of edge cases, regional limits, other festivals that intervene. And having a central authority decide this didn't really scale to a vast empire, especially as that empire was kind of falling apart. People did eventually work out systems to work this out. And this is known as the Computus, which is seems like it's a badass name, Computus, Computus of Borg or something, right? And it sounds a bit like computer as well, because that's sort of what it is. It's an algorithm for figuring out a solution to come up with, to figure out when Easter's supposed to be. And the Computus, though, is pretty complicated. The article in Wikipedia on the Computus is huge and completely insanely detailed, and they have code examples in basic Java and Python and a bunch of other languages on how to do the Computus. Here's a version in Python. And imagine, though, trying to figure this out by hand in the Dark Ages with Roman numerals and without our modern concept of fractions. Okay, so look at all those, look at these numbers and all the complicated stuff going on. Imagine doing this in a numbering system that was really good for tallying, but not very good for complex math. You know, figuring out, just doing this calculation would be difficult. Figuring out what this calculation should be was super difficult. And so it's kind of funny, though, because these are 3 simple rules, right? You ever have this where the spec comes down and it's like 3 simple rules? How long is it going to take you to figure that out? It's like, oh, I get that done by the end of the day, no problem, right? I'll get that done by lunchtime. And then, look at, I mean, I still don't know what 29,578 is. So it's all these magic numbers, all these complicated rounding things just to figure this stuff out. It's so complicated, and it's easy to get wrong, but it's really hard to tell. And so a lot of people tend, you don't really know until the year comes around and suddenly Easter is on a Saturday by accident. And that happened quite a bit in history. And rounding issues and all sorts of stuff. So different places had different versions of the Computus that they worked with. And so you had different Easters. So here's where we get back to Dark Ages Britain. This isn't the United Kingdom. This is definitely not the United Kingdom. This is a whole bunch of different little kingdoms all fighting each other and stuff like that. And it's mid-7th century. And Queen Enfled grew up down in Kent, which is in the southeast. And as you can see, it's very close to France there. And she used a Computus that was from Rome. It's a Roman Computus. And they use a Roman Easter. Well, King Oswy is from Northumbria, which is all the bits of sort of northeast, all the way up even beyond Hadrian's Wall into Scotland. So yes, literally, he is the king in the north. And he was influenced by Ireland and used an Irish Computus. And these 2 Computuses, whatever, were different enough that basically every other year they'd be celebrating Easter at different times, sometimes several weeks apart. And this is about more than just who gets to for painted eggs, right? Easter is the biggest festival of the Christian year. And also the 40 days before it are Lent. And if you're in Lent, you're fasting, you're spending the day praying, you're abstaining from alcohol and things. Meanwhile, if people are celebrating Easter, they're partying really hard. And it's really difficult to have half the household doing one thing and half the other. It also got really even worse because factions were starting. Like different people were going to follow dad's version of Easter and mom's version of Easter. And the factions were forming among the people who would later become kings and queens of Britain later. And so it got really, really messy. And this is also really bad PR. This is the first generation around this part of the world that were Christian. Their parents were worshipers of Thor and Odin. And this is terrible PR for this whole Christianity thing. They can't even figure out when its most important festival is supposed to be. Anyway, so Queen Enfled refused to change her ways. King Oswy didn't know what to do. He finally called the Council of Whitby. You got everybody together, not the Whitby that's just over here, but the other Whitby, the one in Northumbria. And he called in what the year we now call 664. And he called all of his theologians and everyone together at a council to finally figure this thing once and for all. And after a huge amount of debate, they finally decided on the Computus used by Enfled, the Roman Computus. And so Oswy and his kingdom, and eventually the rest of the Britain, switched over to this Roman Computus. Except for Wales, because there's always got to be somebody, but we won't go into that. But anyway, finally they could celebrate Easter together, and they lived happily ever after. more or less. So certainly happier than these poor folks got. Anyway, but what does it have to do with it being 2018 right now, right? Well, the Computus that won at Whitby, as Roman Computus, was created by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, or Little Dennis, in 532 AD. He based his Computus on solar year calculations from Alexandria in Egypt. Now, Alexandria and Egyptians have been doing very sophisticated date work for thousands and thousands of years at this point. But at this time in history, for various complicated reasons I'm really not going to get into much, they used as a baseline for many of their calculations the date of the accession of the Emperor Diocletian. Now, and this is a year that we call 284 AD. Now, Diocletian wasn't actually this bad. He didn't blow up any planets, but he was the last great persecutor of Christians before the whole empire converted a few decades later. So it seemed wrong to sort of commemorate his becoming emperor when you're trying to figure out your Easter calculations for the biggest Christian festival of the year. However, Dionysius noticed that all the various cycles of leap year and days of the week and all sorts of other things like that roll back really cleanly to a date 284 years earlier than this particular date, to a nice round number. And so we thought, why don't I use that? And that's a pretty close baseline to when Jesus was born. Therefore, we can maybe, because it's for Easter anyway, we can call it the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. It'll be great. We can just make it the sort of Jesus year. And we're only using it for calculations anyway. So only like researchers and scientists and mathematicians trying to figure this out are going to care that it's not exactly right, but it's close enough. It works. And this became his baseline day for his calculations, and that was great. But why is it then 2018 still? Well, in 731, another monk named Bede wrote this history book called the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And it was vast, it was huge, it covered 800 years of history. Bede turned out to be from Northumbria. And the Council of Whitby was a really big event at the end of the book. And so he'd also just written, previous to this, he'd written a giant book about Easter calculations, actually. So this Roman Computus from Dionysius was a really, really big deal for him. And so he thought, I'm covering 800 years of history. Why don't I, instead of trying to figure out based on who was king at what point and everything like that, let me just use this baseline numbering system we use for Easter. And so he started putting those dates in the book. This book became a massive hit. As much as he can have a massive hit bestseller in Dark Ages Europe. Charlemagne loved it, even though he was illiterate, he got people to read it to him. But eventually, copies of this book ended up in every library and monastery across Europe, which meant that any other historian who wanted to write their own history book could use the years mentioned in this book as a baseline for their history. And then that spread out further and further into the general culture, and that is why it is 2018 right now. It's 2018 because of a queen, a king, a dead emperor, the Easter, the Jewish lunar calendar, ancient Alexandria, 2 monks, and a book, and Jesus, kind of, sort of, but not really, because all this other stuff in the way. So lesson number 4. We saw how tricky calculations and edge cases lead to multiple computuses and things like that, and eventually cultures competing on which computus they used for figuring out Easter. Well, edge cases can become expressions of individuality and culture. If everybody agrees about something, if everybody agrees about something, then it's not really an issue. If everybody completely disagrees, it's not an issue. It's when they're kind of close and there's little bits that becomes a big identity thing. So think of VI versus Emacs. Think of Canadians versus the US. Think of Android versus iOS. They're quite similar in many ways, but the differences make everyone all, So I'm a Canadian Emacs iOS person, just by the way. And these differences can be about something as simple as an implementation edge case, rather than huge, huge things about how many limbs you have or something. Lesson number 5. Notice how the year numbering started as kind of a handy scratch reference just for your calculations, and then got used in a book, which turned out to be super influential, and then that good enough scratch date became authoritative. That's because temporary things often become permanent. I think anybody who works in software and any kind of engineering knows how that little thing you sort of threw together to make it work, patch it up with some duct tape and twine, turns out to be kind of the foundation that everything else is built on. Think of base 0 for arrays, all sorts of stuff like that. And if you think software is weird like that, you should look at how laws are made and how politics works, because it's all that kind of stuff. Our entire civilization in many ways is built on just patch that thing together and we'll work it out later. So we're to number 3. What's up with 1752? So for this, we need to go back to ancient Rome a bit. So this is a story of a bug. And remember how Easter is based on the spring equinox? over time, as people worked on their computuses, they noticed that the equinox was drifting in the year. It wasn't the same date every year. So what's up with this? So we have to go back to ancient Rome again. So as we saw, days, months, and years don't fit together cleanly. So adjustments have to be made. Now in ancient Rome, before they implemented the calendar that we sort of use now, it was really chaotic. They had sort of this hybrid system where they were mostly lunar, but then they would make adjustments every so often to fit things back into the solar calendar. So you'd have, the year would get further and further off, and then they'd throw an extra month in. You'd have a 13th month. A lot of cultures do this. However, this 13th month was generally considered bad luck, and Romans were super superstitious about this kind of thing. And the decision on when to apply this was being made by politicians. So what could possibly go wrong, right? So it really got chaotic, and there would be sometimes they'd leave it for decades to not make these adjustments. And so years would end up, they'd finally do a giant bulk adjustment year with like 450 days in it, and then the next year would have 200 days in it, and it would just be this whole mess. And this is the kind of thing that gives historians massive headaches, because you can't really tell when anything happened if you go further back in time. Even if they say it happened on July 3rd, you don't even know what that means, because it could have been any number of ways. So they have to do these complicated back calculations, and hopefully somebody had an eclipse that happened around the same time as some other civilization that has better ways of tracking time. Anyway, this became a big mess, and this became really hard, untenable situation anyway. And this was finally fixed by Julius Caesar. Now, he'd been doing a lot of work. He was doing a lot of reforms once he took over and changing a lot of aspects of Roman society. And he'd been spending a lot of time in Egypt, in Alexandria with Cleopatra. And he saw that they were really good at these calendar things. And so he took a lot of the ideas from that and implemented them into what we call the Julian calendar, which is very close to what we have now in Canada here. And the really interesting thing was it had standardized months. They disconnected them from the lunar cycles. They were just by themselves. They standardized months. They took the extra time and sort of sprinkled it amongst all the different months kind of evenly, and then kept February a little short. But then the magic thing was every 4 years, you add an extra day to February. And so it's automatic. You don't have to wait for some politician to decide that it's going to be a good time to do this bad luck thing. You just sort of have it automatically, and it works, right? This is great. It's a self-adjusting year that just always fits. Perfect, right? Well, soon after he implemented all of this, Julius Caesar was assassinated. It wasn't because of this specifically. There was a lot of other stuff going on. But it started this massive decades-long civil war. And part of the problem is they kind of lost the records on how to exactly do this. And they went back to the source materials, which had been written by some Greek, Egyptian scientist or whatever, who kind of used every count of 3 of the year, blah, 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 blah. So they actually, instead of doing it every 4 years for the first few decades, they did it every 3 years. Because yes, this is an off by 1 error from 50 BC. If you think of cache invalidation as a sense of cultural leftovers, like the names of the months, we're covered all 3 of these, and we haven't even made it to 1000 AD yet. Right? So anyway, the Western world now had this awesome, consistent, predictable, self-correcting calendar that was freed from all these manual adjustments and meddling politicians and everything. And this was so useful that it continued on even after the empire collapsed and Europe was invaded by barbarian hordes, and even the barbarians quickly decided to adapt this calendar because it was so useful. You could finally figure out when things were supposed to happen. So that was awesome. But the problem is, the year isn't 365 and a quarter days. It's 365.2425 and change days. So you lose about a day still every 100 years. And this is one of those weird bugs that's too big a scope for it to really bother anybody in their particular lifetime, because no one's going to live really long enough to see that problem directly happen. So, by the time of Dionysius and Enfled and all that, they're already about a week different from the official solar when the equinox is supposed to happen. So that became difficult for your Easter calculations. And it's supposed to be March 20th for the equinox, but it's kept moving around. By the High Middle Ages, the 12th century or so, it was 10 days difference. So this is a bug, right? This is a bug like the kind of bug that we have in our various systems that we work on. That is, of course, an early bug discovered by Grace Hopper. And this is a sort of famous, I don't know if it's the first bug. I think it was sort of a term already in use, but they actually found a moth had clogged up a relay, so they stuck it in the notebook, and she said, this is the first bug. Anyway, so this is a bug. It's a bug in a critical system that everybody uses literally every day. And every power in Europe had to try to figure out how to fix this. And these aren't engineers, right? These are emperors and kings and whatever. And this is why I love studying history, though, because every programmer and team and company has to deal with bugs. And here we're watching like popes dealing with bugs, and it's really kind of fascinating to see how that works. And there's a whole other talk I could do about all the different steps taken to try to work this kind of stuff out. But I'm just going to quickly, sometimes it doesn't work. There we go. Yeah, finally, in 1563, after a whole lot of back and forth, they finally worked it out at what's called the Council of Trent. And they came up with a new system where you skip the leap year every century, except for every 400 years. Okay, so you skipped every 400 years, which the first one of that was 1600, and the next one was 2000. So this was actually one of the more obscure Y2K bugs, if anybody was around for that. It was one that you'd only catch if you were being clever enough to know that you didn't have to on the century. So it's one that actually, if you didn't pay attention, you were safe from. It was only the smart people had to deal with. Anyway, so it became one of the more obscure Y2K bugs. But they finally figured this out, and they cut 10 days out of the calendar to get the equinoxes back in sync, and everything was all better. The council was called by Pope Gregory, and so it's called the Gregorian calendar. And it's what most of the world tends to use today. It's what we use here in Canada. So, whew, bug marked as resolved, closed the ticket, we are done. Awesome. But wait. By this time, Europe was now split between Catholics and Protestants, and they didn't get along very well. So Protestant churches were not going to go change their calendar because of what some pope down in Rome said, right? So for several centuries, half of Europe was about 10 days ahead of the other half. So you could leave France and arrive in England in the past. Now this, of course, is yet another thing that gives historians unbelievable headaches because something happens. We're talking, it's not even that long ago. People, fairly sophisticated civilization and everything, and they're like, oh, well, somebody, this happened on April 2nd. Well, not across the channel it didn't. There'd be places which got, during some of the wars where, Catholics invaded a Protestant area or vice versa, and they all had to shift their calendars around. It was a huge mess. It's hard, once again, to figure out where these things happened. Eventually, the various non-Catholic countries started converting over and switching over to this new system. And remember how the date slips by about every century or so? So we're getting closer and closer to 1700, which means if we don't do something soon, it's going to get worse. You're going to have an extra day to have to deal with. And England started worrying about this in the late 1600s. They had all sorts of other stuff to worry about, civil wars and things like that. But they were hoping to catch up before things shifted an extra day even more in 1700. Well, this is what English politics looks like in the mid-18th century. So they finally did work it out in 1752, so only a little bit behind schedule, only half a century late. But they finally, in 1752, they implemented this adjustment, and they took 11 days out of September, and that is why you see this when you do Cal 1752. If your locale is England, United States, or Canada, if your locale is set to France or something else, you get something different. Now, of course, being a Unix command, cal has a special version that does all sorts of more stuff, and it's called ncal. And ncal, actually, if you include ncal-e and then a year, it'll give you the Easter for that year, which means you have a Computus on your computer. So there you can see there's our Easter is going to be April 1st this year. You can see 1867, it was 21st of April. 664, the first Easter they could finally celebrate together was in 21st of April back in the day. But one thing they do to have to be able to figure this out is they have to figure out, based on your locale, when your calendar shifted. And so there's this ncal-p gives you a little database they have, and I want to do a whole separate talk just about this screen, because it shows where all the different countries switched over from the Gregorian calendar to the Julian calendar. And you can sort of, if you know some of your stuff, there's like Austria, France, Belgium, all switched in 1580s. Then Protestant countries switched in 1700s, et cetera, et cetera. A whole bunch of Eastern Europe only switched in like 1918, 1920. Turkey switched in 1926. Interesting one, Russia switched when the communists took over. What's interesting is the October Revolution in Russia actually took place in November everywhere else because they were using the old calendar system. Once again, just trying to look stuff up in the newspaper was always, you have to remember that there's date offsets. In fact, not everybody is on board yet. Orthodox churches in the East, like the Russian and Greek Orthodox churches, still use the old Julian calendar. And so that's why Greek Easter is usually about a week and a half, 2 weeks later than Catholic Easter. So, lesson number 6. Bugs aren't just in software. Software is simply a kind of a codified process, often a very complex, sophisticated codified process, but basically a process. And there are many other codified processes out there. Lost luggage is a kind of a bug in a process, right? This leap year situation was a kind of a bug. So I think it's interesting to look at bigger things in the world outside of software as bugs, you know? Although unit tests kind of be a little tricky for things like this. Lesson 7. Just like bugs are difficult to fix in live software, calendar bugs are extra difficult to fix because it's running all the time, right? It's a system that's live, because applying patches to a live culture can be tricky. Like any bug, you have to figure out the problem, and then you got to figure out a solution that works, and then you have to get people to accept the change. And that turns out often to be the biggest problem and the biggest headache in the whole process. The problems aren't technical as much as they are cultural. And cultural problems are often bigger than the technical ones. I think it was really interesting. The opening keynote was, a lot of it was about people, how people just use the tools that are being made, and the quality is the usability rather than the technical details of exactly how something works. And I think it's really important. This is an ongoing problem with things like social media these days, where people have invented all sorts of great things in Facebook and Twitter, but they haven't really figured out the cultural issues attending all of those in terms of all the other backlash stuff that can happen. So lesson 8, and this is one of the reasons I love finding out about history. If you think your project is taking too long, or the standard you're working on is too weird, or the requirements are conflicted and confusing, and the users are like resisting your changes, you're not alone. Because every large project is a fiasco. Right? Every single one has its own aspect of fiasco. And I just love thinking about the centuries it took to solve this one bug, and it still hasn't been fixed everywhere yet. You're not the first, you won't be the last, and many people have probably had it much worse than you. Just think of all these popes and stuff. Okay, so final one, Oxford time. So by 1752, dates had sort of settled down, but time was just starting to get interesting. Now, telling time, like what time of day it is, has mostly been about figuring out when it is in relation to noon, right? It's pretty easy to figure out when it's noon, when it's the shadows shortest in the sky, and you can use some special tools for that, but it's pretty obvious. You can use a stick or a hole in the ground too. So it's pretty handy. But the thing was with noon is that noon is different everywhere you go, east and west. So if it's noon here, it's 11:56 in London, and it's 12:03 in Toronto, right? Officially, if you're going by the actual, when specifically it is noon, if you've got your special instruments out. If you pull even back further, right? So if it's noon here, it's 11:49 in Windsor, Detroit, and it's 12:26 in Montreal. Okay, so now this is fine, not that big a difference, especially if you're all walking on foot, and if your society doesn't require lots of coordination down to the split second, it's okay, it doesn't make a big deal. But by around the late 18th century, trains were coming online, networks of railroads were crossing entire continents. People had to communicate and coordinate these vast networks of trains, where a few minutes of difference in different places started to become a big headache. Soon after that, they invented the telegraph, and people were now communicating at the speed of light. And suddenly, oh, I'll give you a call at 1. Well, which one? What time is 1? Is that 1:15 because you're over there, right? Became this huge problem. Coordinating all this stuff became a huge headache. This is a tower in Halifax, and a park in Halifax called Fleming's Dingle, which causes lots of people to giggle. But it's where the famous engineer and inventor Sir Stanford Fleming had his retirement home. It's now a park. It's really pleasant and lovely there. Anyway, in 1876, Stanford Fleming missed a train, and he was really upset about this. And he decided, we have to institute a global standardized time, and we're going to just work on this. And it became his passion project for years and years and years to get a universal time for around the world. He hit the publicity road and did lots of speeches and got lots of momentum behind the idea. And it finally came to pass just a few years later that they actually implemented a global universal time, but not quite like he imagined. Instead, we got Greenwich Mean Time, which is great because it was already there. It was already being used. Sailors have always needed really precise standardized time to help with their navigation. And so the Royal Observatory of Greenwich, east of London, established this Greenwich Mean Time in 1675 to provide a baseline for sailors to be able to figure out where they were. And the railway networks already liked the standardized time. It was great. So they started standardizing on GMT as early as 1847. And finally, all of Britain standardized about August 1880. And then Stanford Fleming got over the fact that he didn't pick his system, but he got all the North American railways to standardize in 1883. And time zones, sort of an extra aspect of Greenwich Mean Time, became official in 1918. So only 100 years ago. So not that long, in fact. But the thing is, time zones enforce noon in a place even when it actually isn't noon, right? It's only really correct in a little thin strip about a minute wide in the middle of a time zone. Everywhere else, it's actually the wrong time. So here is a sundial in the public gardens in Halifax, and they have a little note at the bottom. Mean sun time in Halifax is 1 hour, 14 minutes behind Atlantic Daylight Time. You only go to this park in the summer, so that's what daylight savings. I took the photo at 2:19 p.m., and you can see there it says it's 1:04, right? So in Halifax, we're actually 15 minutes off and an hour and 15 minutes off in the summer. Not everybody was a fan of this kind of thing. Why say it's noon when you can tell it clearly isn't noon by simply looking out of the window? A lot of places kind of resented being mandated the wrong time. So if you look around, you can find a lot of clocks from the late 19th century with 2-minute hands. Like this one is from the Bristol Exchange, where you can see there's a lighter pink and a sort of darker red minute hand. They're 10 minutes apart. And that's because Bristol is 2 degrees, 35 minutes west of Greenwich, or 10 minutes earlier. So they have 2 sets of minute hands, so you can tell, based on whether you're doing local time or official time, which one it is. Now, Oxford is 1 degree, 15 minutes west of Greenwich, which is, you guessed it, 5 minutes and 2 seconds earlier than Greenwich. So Oxford time is simply the correct time in Oxford in sort of this petty resistance to central authority. Because I think they probably wanted to have their time. That's where all the scientists and smart people are, right? We're going to have our time there, not this Greenwich thing. So that's why at Christchurch College, you can be 5 minutes and 2 seconds late for class because you're not actually late in Oxford. You're only late in Greenwich over there. So lesson 9. The UK is like many other places, where the big main city is kind of resented by the rest of the country. Halifax has that issue in Nova Scotia. Toronto obviously has that issue with the rest of Canada. Never underestimate the durability of a passive-aggressive grudge, right? Once again, in implementing technologies and implementing stuff, dealing with social and cultural issues with technology, passive-aggressive grudges can really just dig along forever. Oxford time has been going on for 140 years or so now. Lesson 10. So just another thing to think about here. One of the biggest revolutions in time tracking, time zones, and one of the foundations of our entire global civilization actually makes things less correct for almost everybody, right? Because wrong but consistent is often much more useful than correct and messy. The engineer in us, the person who wants to get 100% test coverage, kind of cringes at this, but it's true, right? Time zones make it easier for everybody and for everyone to coordinate rather than every single place has different time. So we've learned about 4 weird things here and what's going on behind them, and hopefully learned a few lessons along the way. And all this story may be interesting, right? But come on, this is all the past. We're in the 21st century now, right? Well, arbitrary adjustments aren't just a thing of the past. I just saw this last week. The EU is going to stop daylight savings time in 2019, including in the article, but there are fears that Europe is headed for time zone chaos. And don't even ask me what the UK is going to do because of Brexit and everything, whether they're going to, anyway, so you can just imagine the kind of chaos and stuff that's going on. And still, once again, we couldn't even have sort of a slightly lower key replay of the 17th century situation where people can leave one place and arrive in the past in another. But time is also just getting weird in terms of actually precision measurement of it. The GPS satellite system, for example, has to take into account time dilation effects due to relativity, because where they are in the gravity well and how fast they're moving and everything, so they can do active things. Because time is actually much more elastic. So the time on a GPS satellite is quite different than time is down here. So you have to offset that to be able to actually figure out where you are. I gave this talk at another conference a while back, and the person after me was talking about how to coordinate satellites in different positions around the sun, which is very, very difficult because the messages are all coming at different times and you can't sync them properly. It's very lengthy. So it was a really good lead in directly to that. He was like, you have no idea how weird this is. And it's only going to get worse, right? Timing gets really finer. Things move faster. We're going to start spreading out to other planets and other parts of the solar system. It's going to get really, really strange. Did anybody see the XKCD yesterday? The timing on this was perfect. Under my time system, the sun rises at 6 a.m. and sets at 6 p.m. as it should. The length of the second is different each day and night, and the current time shifts with your latitude and longitude. Today is one of the 2 days each year when my clocks run at the same speed as everyone else's. Time standards are so unfixably messy and complicated that at this point my impulse is to try to make them worse. What's funny, though, is actually this time system is pretty close to what people used to do before they had clocks. Basically, you just measure out the amount of daylight, slice it up into slices, 6 slices, and there you go. That's it. So it's actually not that weird. It's just much more precise. Precise but wrong. Right? So lesson 11. Our standards and the basic foundation we base our lives on often come from surprisingly random coincidences and situations. Our standards are often based on less rigor than you might think. I sort of covered that a little bit earlier. It doesn't mean they often aren't useful, but it helps to be aware of how arbitrary they can often be and how often they can maybe change. And finally, and this is something I've seen the technology and software world wrestling with a lot with today, these days. The cycles of the sun and the moon and the earth are completely disconnected from humanity, right? We have no influence on them at all. There's possibly no other thing that's more completely abstract than the way the sun moves, or earth moves around the sun and the moon moves around the earth. They're about as pure an example of abstract physics as possible. But you've seen in this talk, our ways of relating to this purity have been full of cultural, political, and even personal relationship and religious implications. No matter how abstract something may seem, it ends up often becoming personal, cultural, and political. So think about this next time you see someone talking about code is just pure logic. Why are you making it so political, right? Because in the end, somebody's writing that code, somebody's using that code, somebody's using UX to access that code. These all end up becoming cultural and personal issues. The pure logic may stand on its own, but the minute you decide to name a variable something, that's going to cause something to have some kind of a personal relationship. This applies to all sorts of more or less pure topics, things like, race, language, the free market, meritocracy. These are all words that seem really abstract and solid, but actually turn out to be super loaded. Even something that has an abstract core, as soon as it interacts with people, it becomes cultural. So time and dates are all around us these days, on all our devices and in all of our systems. And as you've seen, the ways we measure and track them have been influenced by centuries of weirdness. So next time you hear someone arguing that some system is pure, or saying it's as clear as that clock on the wall right there, that's how obvious it is, just look at the time or date on your device and think of how many coincidences, how many wrong things, how much politics, how much just plain weirdness have gone into the things that underpin the way that we understand and manage the world. Thank you.